campus and to this year's fall convocation. It is wonderful, as Dean Stone mentioned, to see you and to be together here on this beautiful campus on this brisk morning. And I'm honored to get us started this morning as I introduce our distinguished Fondren lecturer. This morning for the Fondren Lecture, Christian Mission and Community Engagement. Following the lecture, our lecturer, Dr. Monika Ardelt, will be joined on stage by Reverend Dr. Michael Beck, who is the new director of Fresh Expressions at Southern Methodist University Perkins School of Theology. And they will be in conversation together and then welcome questions and discussions from you as we open up that dialogue to everyone. So it'll be a rich time together. Dr. Monika Ardelt is Professor of Sociology at the University of Florida. Thank you for braving the Texas cold all the way from Florida. She is Professor of Sociology, founding faculty member and member of the advisory board of the University of Florida Center for Spirituality and Health, and a member of the University of Florida Mindfulness Initiative. She is a Brookdale National Fellow, Positive Psychology Templeton Senior Fellow, and a Fellow of the Gerontological Society of America. Dr. Ardelt developed the widely used three-dimensional wisdom scale and is the co-editor of the book Faith and Well-Being in Late Life, Linking Theories with Evidence in an Interdisciplinary Inquiry. Her research focuses on successful human development across the life course, and she's published numerous articles on relations between wisdom, spirituality, religiosity, well-being, aging well, and dying well. It is an honor to have you with us, Dr. Ardelt. Would you join me in help me welcoming her to SMU this morning?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here. So, I will present some of my research that I have been doing for many years now, and I've done quite a lot of research on wisdom, but one of the things that really interested me, how is wisdom related to religion and spirituality? So I'm going to address these questions. First of all, what are the differences between wisdom, religiosity, and spirituality? Are wise people likely to be religious and spiritual, and are religious and spiritual people likely to be wise? That was actually one of the questions I really wanted to study, and you will see the answer to this question. And then how do wisdom, religiosity, and spirituality affect psychological and subjective well-being and attitudes toward death? How do relatively low and high wisdom and religious spirituality reality manifest in 4 older individual lives, and I want to give you 4 case studies. And then I want to end by talking about what are components of practical wisdom for professionals, just as yourselves. So let's start with the first question. How are wisdom, religiosity, and spirituality defined and assessed? Now, there are actually quite a lot of definitions and measurements of wisdom out there by now. When I started out many years ago now, really with my dissertation, it was also all over the place, and it kind of has converged to a certain degree, but I only want to show you 2 models. And the first model, of course, is the model that I'm using, right? It's a 3-dimensional wisdom model, and it's actually based on research by Vivian Clayton. It's her dissertation when she asked different people from young, middle-aged, and older adults, what do you think are characteristics of wisdom? And then she gave another group of young, middle-aged, and older adults these characteristics as well. What do you think, how characteristics are these characteristics of wisdom, of intelligence, and of yourself? oneself, and then she did a multidimensional scaling analysis, and she came up with these 3 dimensions. And when I started to study, to think about measuring wisdom, that was the model that made most sense to me. So, because first of all, if you think of wise people, right? If you think of wise people, at least for me, it was wise people know something, right? They know something that other people do not know. And that's the cognitive component. See, and it's related to the ability to perceive reality as it is, meaning not as you would like it to be, but as it actually is. And in order to do this, wise people have an understanding of life, but also they have a desire to know the deeper truths. And particularly related to oneself, understanding oneself, but also understanding other people. I think this is particularly very important, in ministry, I think. And in order to do this, wise people have knowledge and acceptance of the positive and the negative aspects of human nature, the inherent limits of knowledge, and life's unpredictability and uncertainties. But in order to get to this kind of deeper kind of knowledge, I think the reflective component is required. By looking at things from multiple perspectives and overcoming subjectivity and projections, people often realize that they also have, some vulnerabilities, some negative aspects, and that might make them more compassionate and tolerant toward other people, but also allows them to overcome subjectivity and projections, to reduce their ego-centeredness, which allows them to see reality more clearly, and then through the reduction of ego-centeredness, it leads to greater compassion, sympathy and compassion for others, and the motivation to alleviate suffering. So how do you assess 3-dimensional wisdom? So this is when I created the 3-dimensional wisdom scale, and the 3-dimensional wisdom scale has 3 components, of course, but also the cognitive dimension consists of kind of 3 subdimensions: the ability and willingness to understand a situation or phenomenon thoroughly. Now, I have to tell you, an example is ignorance is bliss, and of course it measures the absence of wisdom. Now, when I created the scale, I started out with kind of 140 items, often from existing scales, and all the positively worded items for the cognitive dimension, things like, I always like to go to the heart of the problem, they didn't work out. They were either affected by social desirability, or it just didn't have a variation. Everybody was like, yeah, sounds good, yes, I agree. But you need some variation in order to see relationships between variables. And so I ended up only, for the cognitive dimension, I ended up only with items that measure the absence of wisdom. So they all reverse score. So the second one is acknowledgement of ambiguity, complexity, and uncertainty in life. So again, a problem has little attraction for me if I don't think it has a solution. So this measures the absence of wisdom, right? If you agree with that, it would be the absence. So you have to disagree if you have wisdom. And then the ability to make important decisions despite life's unpredictability and uncertainty. I'm hesitant about making important decisions after thinking about them. The reflective dimension has 2 subcomponents: ability and willingness to look at phenomena and events from different perspectives. I always try to look at all sides of the problem, and the absence of subjectivity and projections. So again, this is a reverse item. When I look back on what has happened to me, I can't help feeling resentful. So this would be, you have to disagree, nurturing emotions and behavior toward others. Sometimes, as an example item, sometimes I feel a real compassion for everyone. And the absence of indifferent or negative emotions and behavior toward people. I don't like to get involved in listening to another person's trouble, so we would have to disagree with that. Okay, so this is one of the models. The other model is wisdom as self-transcendence. This is based on Levinson and all model how they assess wisdom, but it's based on Cournot's theory. Cournot reviewed wisdom theories from around the world, from ancient times and contemporary times, and he came to the conclusion that wisdom development happens in 4 stages. So the first stage is self-knowledge. Who am I? And this question is often answered through our social roles or our behavioral tendencies. So for example, right, who am I? I'm a professor, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm an introvert, right? But then at the second stage, people realize that there's this detachment, awareness of the changing nature of everything, including our social roles. You know, what does it mean to be a mother when your children are adults? This has changed. What does it mean to be a daughter if your parents have died? You know, and even behavioral tendency change with time. It's not the same. You know, things develop, things change. And that means our sense of self is not as solid as we might have thought initially. And then at the third stage of integration, this is the dissolution of separate inner selves to come to accept the whole self, even the shadow part of ourselves. And to basically accept that, you know, like other people, we have positive aspects and not so positive aspects. But that leads us to this 4th stage, and that's a self-transcendence. To realize that we are all in the same boat, basically. We are all kind of the same. We all have positive aspects, we have negative aspects, but we also all want the same. We want to have peace, harmony, we want to be happy, we want to overcome our negative tendencies. And so we are not as different as we thought, we are connected. And this self-transcendence, this is what Levinson tries to measure with the Adult Self-Transcendence Inventory, the ASCII. So it has, if it measured with 24 items, it has 5 subscales. One is self-knowledge and integration. So for example, I have a good sense of humor about myself. The second one is peace of mind. An example would be I often engage in quiet contemplation. Non-attachment, example is I don't worry about other people's opinion of me. Self-transcendence, I feel that my individual life is part of a greater whole. And presence in the here and now, 6 items, I find much joy in life. And all of these scales are basically measured on Likert scale items ranging from 1 to 5, typically strongly disagree to strongly agree, and then they are all scored in the direction of higher wisdom. Okay, so this is 2 models of wisdom and 2 ways of measuring wisdom, and we will need this when I show you the results of my research. Now, how do we define and measure religiosity and spirituality? It's hard to believe, but it's even harder to define spirituality than wisdom, because spirituality is really all over the place. Religiosity is often measured in the literature by, you know, how often do you go to church, or how often do you pray, rather than, well, you know, what is it about this religiosity? So in spirituality, I like one definition of spirituality. It's by Sinbao and Pargament, I think, which says spirituality is related to the sacred in some ways. I like this definition because it really gets us into this transcendence. Now, what I've used in my research there, basically show you 3 ways to measure it. A very simple way to measure is you basically ask people, how religious and how spiritual are you on a scale from 0 to 10? Right? 0 means not religious or not spiritual at all, and 10, very religious, very spiritual. And they can come up with their own definition of religiosity and spirituality. That's a very simple way of doing it. Another way is trying to measure the strength of spiritual beliefs. And I like to use 10 items from the Spiritual Involvement and Belief Scales by Hash et al. And I like this scale because it's very non-denominational. It never refers to God or to Allah or anything like this. It always refers to a higher force, something like this. So basically it can be used for any kind of religion. So an example is a spiritual force influences events in my life. And then, what I also like, there's a distinction between an extrinsic and an intrinsic religious orientation. And this is based on Albert and Ross scales from the 50s. And they basically said people might have different religious orientations. An extrinsic religious orientation is that people go to church or are religious for extrinsic reasons. Now, what might these extrinsic reasons be? Well, to increase their standing in the community, for example, or to make friends, or even to find solace in times of hardship. That's still an extrinsic motivation. There's an intrinsic religious orientation is people who live their religion. So they have dedicated their life to God or a higher power. And an example item would be, I try hard to carry my religion over into all my other dealings in life. So, let's go to the second question. Are wise people likely to be religious and spiritual, and are religious and spiritual people likely to be wise? So I'm going to show you different data sets from contemporary to some of the data sets that I have selected many years ago. So the first one is a contemporary undergraduate student sample. The data were collected in the spring of 23 to 25, and it's a sample of 636 undergraduates with a mean and median age of 90 years, and most were freshmen and sophomores, and about 62% were female and 59% were white. So if we look at correlations between strengths of spiritual beliefs, so I'm using the spiritual belief scale for this, and wisdom, what do we find? Well, first of all, with the 3-dimensional wisdom scale, there's no correlation. So for those of you who might not be up to date on statistics, or so just a very, very quick refresher, okay? What do these numbers mean, right? So correlations basically vary between -1 and +1, and if it were +1, that means all religious people are wise, and all wise people are religious, and everybody who's not religious is not wise, and the other way around. So it would be a perfect relationship, right? And the closer it is to 0, there's no relationship. It's basically you might be wise or you might be religious, but there's no relationship. And so this here, do I have a thing here? I don't think. But anyway, this around 0 means there's no relationship. Nothing. You might either be religious or you might be wise, but there's no relationship. But if you look at the ASTI, self-transcendence, you do see a relationship. So it depends how you measure it. So self-transcendence is related to the strength of spiritual beliefs. And a 0.3 means, well, it's moderate. It's moderate, but often in social science you don't get really much higher correlation than 0.5, really. I mean, if you think you have a 0.5, it's like, right? I mean, and if you get something like 0.7, you say, well, you basically measure the same thing, right? So people get suspicious. So that's pretty, moderately high. Now, I was interested also, even so, to measure wisdom, I think the 3 dimensions are required. All 3 dimensions are required. You can't just have one dimension, right? And they are positively correlated, so they are related. However, I was curious if it varies by the dimensions. And I would think, that the compassionate dimension would be most strongly related to spiritual beliefs. And indeed, this is what we found. This is actually, the cognitive dimension is actually negatively related. Oh, weakly, but it's significant, meaning it couldn't happen by chance alone. And the reflective dimension is positive, but very weak. But yes, as predicted, the compassionate dimension, again, it's still weak, but at least it's positively related. So then, if we look at the 5 ASTI subscales, we find positive correlations for all of them. So this is self-knowledge and integration, peace of mind, non-attachment, but it's relatively weak. But where the action is self-transcendence. And that makes sense, right? Self-transcendence is the most strongly related to spiritual belief, strength of spiritual belief. And again, presence in the here and now, weakly. All are positively, but weakly. Okay, then let's look at an international sample. These data were collected in 2008 to 2011. It's a sample of 612 respondents from 6 countries: United States, Canada, Serbia, Ukraine, Iran, and China. And we collected 2 age groups: young adults between the ages of 19 and 33, with a mean age of 24, and we have 83% belong to the millennial generation, and then older adults, another half of the sample is older adults between the age of 59 to 99, with a mean age of 72.5, and 74.3% belong to the silent generation. And about half were female. So if we look at this, and here, degree of spirituality and religiosity was simply assessed from 0 to 10. How religious, spiritual are you, from 0 to 10. So if we look at this, what we find is, and over the line, it's statistically significant, even so the correlations are very similar between the 3-dimensional wisdom scale and the ASTI, but only the ASTI is significant, couldn't happen by chance, but they're positively related. And that's for younger adults, and it's also true for older adults. So there is a weak but positive correlation between wisdom and spirituality. But if we look at the correlation between wisdom and religiosity, we even find a negative correlation between 3-dimensional wisdom for young adults and religiosity, and no for ASTI, no correlation for ASTI, and the same is true for the older adults. So this is interesting, right? I mean, yes, spirituality, no religiosity. Why is that? I have some ideas. Okay, and then if we want to look at the 3 dimensions here, which I find really interesting. So for the young adults, there's nothing there, but they're all positively for spirituality. But interestingly, for the older adults, it's the cognitive dimension that is significantly positively related with spirituality. And then if we look at religiosity, both the reflective and the cognitive dimension are negatively related for the young adults with religiosity, and also for older adults. So here, cognitive dimension spirituality, yes, but religiosity, no. Right? Isn't this interesting? All right. Then let's look at the greatest and silent generation sample. this is data I collected many years ago in, between 1999 and 2001. It consists of 116 older community residents, 23 nursing home residents, and 19 hospice patients. And so the age range is between 56 and 98 years. And 60% belong to the greatest generation and 40% to the silent generation. Mean and median age was 74 years, 67% were women, and 78% were white. So wisdom was assessed by the Swedish Wisdom Scale, and religious spirituality was assessed by the average of an intrinsic religious orientation and strength of spiritual belief. So taking the average, and they were highly correlated. Okay, so if we look at the correlations, what do we find? Basically no correlation between religious spirituality and the three-dimensional wisdom scale. But then again, here's a negative correlation with the cognitive component, a positive but not significant correlation with the reflective, but a significant positive but still weak correlation with compassion, with the compassionate dimension. And how does it look like? So let me show you, this is actually what the distribution looks like, right, in terms of numbers. So you have, here the religious spirituality ranging from 1 to 5, and then the wisdom from 1 to 5. And so if I put up lines here, so everything to the right of the red line, these are people who are high on religious spirituality, and there are quite a bit who are high. Again, this was collected, in Florida, around Gainesville, so yeah, it's still the South, the religious South, so I'm not too surprised. Older adults too. And these below 3 would be the ones that are really, really low in religious spirituality, and there aren't that many. But I put relatively low would be everybody lower than 4. And then if you look at high wisdom, everybody above this line, there aren't that many either, right? Not that many that are high on wisdom. And below this line, they are relatively low on wisdom. We have a little bit more people there. But it's also interesting that we have nobody who's both low on wisdom and low on religious spirituality, right? Here, some people that are relatively low on wisdom and on religious spirituality, but very few. And these are the folks who are high on books. These people here are high on religious spirituality, but low on wisdom. And these 3 people here are low on religious spirituality, but high on wisdom. And not a lot of folks are there. So just if we look, this is the distribution. As we see here, there are most of them are high on religious spirituality, but low on wisdom. And very few are actually high on wisdom, either also high on religious spirituality, or not high on religious spirituality. So wisdom is not that prevalent, let's put it this way. So to answer the question, are wise people likely to be religious and spiritual, and are religious and spiritual people likely to be wise? The answer is, well, it depends. It depends on the definition and measurement of wisdom, religiosity, and spirituality. However, it appears that wise people are more likely to be spiritual than religious, and that wisdom and spirituality, and that wisdom and religiosity are unrelated. So how do wisdom, religious spirituality, and religiosity affect psychological and subjective well-being and attitudes toward death? Okay, I'm going back to the greatest and silent generation sample that I just introduced. And here, if you look at, this is again, just look at, let me see if I can do that. I do this? Yeah. Okay. Well, my angle I can't fit. But anyway, so ignore the other ones. Just look at the betas here. plus 1, so the higher they are, the stronger the association. So wisdom is positively related to purpose in life, feeling of purpose in life, feeling of mastery and I'm in control of my life, and also subjective well-being. But religious spirituality is too. It is positively related to purpose in life, but not to mastery. And I think it's interesting that it's not positively related to mastery, because if God is in control, then I'm not, right? Then I'm not. It's God that is in control. But it is related to subjective well-being, but the relationship with wisdom is stronger than religious spirituality. And then if we look at how these two variables related to fear of death and death avoidance, again, wisdom is negatively related to fear of death and death avoidance, but there is a curvilinear relationship with religiosity and fear of death, but none with death avoidance. And how does this look like, this curvilinear relationship? It looks like this. Well, first of all these numbers are below 3. That means people are really not afraid of death, or at least they say that they are not afraid of death. But it's interestingly that in the middle, they're a little bit higher. They're a little bit more afraid of death, right? So if they are on the fence, so if you're not religious at all, it's fine, right? I mean, I don't believe in this stuff, so I'm okay. I'm not afraid of death. If you're very religious, I will be in heaven. I'm not afraid of death. But if you're in the middle, I'm not sure where I will end up with, right? And that might be maybe a little bit more afraid of death. Okay, let's look at pathways from wisdom and religiosity to individual well-being. I'm going back to the international data, but I'm only using the United States and Canada sample. Again, same thing, 2 age groups, and here half were female. So first of all, if we look at the direct effects for controlling for life conditions, so I'm controlling for all kinds of life conditions, we do see that, yes, wisdom is positively related to subjective well-being, and yes, religiosity is also positively related to subjective well-being, but it's weaker. It's weaker. And here, religiosity again is just measured between 0 and 10. How religious are you on a scale from 0 to 10? But so, what might explain this association between wisdom and religiosity and subjective well-being? So, if we look at the path model, both wisdom and religiosity are related to mastery, but it's a little bit stronger. This relationship between wisdom and mastery is a little bit stronger for older adults than younger adults. But mastery is weakly, but still related to subjective well-being. And then both are related to purpose in life, and purpose in life has at least a moderate effect on subjective well-being. However, mastery is also related to purpose in life, and it's stronger for younger adults than older adults. So for older adults, mastery might not be necessary to have a greater purpose in life, but for younger adults, there seems to be, if they feel that they are in control, they also feel that they have a purpose in life. Now, if we look at, and then so it explains about half of the effect of the direct effect of purpose in life and religiosity on subjective well-being. So if we look at just at these numbers here, what we see is that yes, wisdom is related to total effect. If we add up the direct effect and the indirect effect, so wisdom is related to subjective well-being, and the effect is about twice as much as for religiosity. So to answer the question, how do wisdom, religious spirituality, and religiosity affect psychological and subjective well-being and attitudes toward death? The answer is wisdom and religious spirituality, religiosity seem to be two independent pathways to psychological and subjective well-being. So two independent pathways. You can go either this way or that way, right? And spirituality, however, appears to increase fear of this. Okay, so number 4. How do relatively low and high wisdom in religious spirituality manifest in 4 older individuals' lives from the greatest and silent generations? So I want to read to you 4 case studies from my more qualitative research. And the first case is Leanne, and of course all of these names are pseudonyms. A 76-year-old white divorced nursing home resident with no high school degree who used to be a semi-skilled worker. Leanne had the 8th lowest religious spirituality score and a relatively low wisdom score. Also, Leanne's parents were Catholic. She became a Protestant when she was young because she liked the Protestant church better than the Catholic church. However, she lost all interest in church and religion at the age of about 15 and 16 years. She said, "I was saved when I was young, but when I got older, I didn't bother." To the question of how her daily life was influenced by spiritual beliefs, Leanne answered, "Hardly anything." When asked what kind of religious or spiritual practices she engaged, she replied, "I hardly do." Leanne did not participate in the spiritual and religious activities offered by the nursing home, did not listen to religious programs, did not pray, and did not read the Bible. Yet she still believed in God, who, she said, quote, "controls everybody." However, when asked if there was any other meaning that she associated with God and what God means to her personally, she replied, "I never thought about it." Later in the interview, she added, "I have no religion as far as God is concerned. Faith in God? I don't have much." Leanne seemed to have lost all faith in God about 5 years earlier after his sisters and brother died and left her all alone. However, there was no indication that Leanne had been spiritual or religious when her siblings were still alive. When asked what she thought was the meaning of life, Leanne said, "I figure if my children got their religion, that was the main thing. I didn't care for it." When probed what she thought was the meaning of her life, what gave her life purpose, and what helped her to keep going, Leanne replied, "I don't feel like my life has that much purpose because I've lost so much time, people that I was close to, and I'm alone now." Leanne neither had religion or wisdom to help her cope with hardship, which left her feeling alone and depressed. So clearly not good if you have neither of it, right? Okay, the next case is Jerome, a 61-year-old African-American hospice patient who had a high religious spirituality score, but the 4th lowest wisdom score. Jerome had metastatic cancer, had no high school degree, had been a farmer throughout life, was separated from his wife of 37 years, and lived at home. Jerome was a lifelong Baptist, and he stated that all of his present life was influenced by his religion. He said, "I believe in the Savior. I believe I'm in God's hand. I talk to him daily, all through the day. I'm not going to take a chance. If something hits you, it hits you. You can't help it." Jerome might have tried to stay in constant contact with God to keep the door to heaven open in case of a sudden death. To the question, "What does God mean to you?" Jerome answered, "Everything. Without God, we wouldn't be nothing. He's the one who created us. God never left me. He won't leave me. He promised that. He said, 'I'll give us and I will take us. Blessed be the name of the Lord.' You see, I got cancer. They gave me 3 or 4 months to live, but God hasn't killed me yet. God put me here and he isn't going to leave me. They gave me the diagnosis about a month and a half ago, but I know God has given me time." Jerome was convinced that God is and always was with him, even during the times when he did not follow the teachings of his faith. He stated that his faith had become stronger due to his illness. He said, "I'm more close in spirit than I was, some of it because I've got cancer." This kind of religious faith, however, might become problematic when the prophecy that God has given Although Jerome lived about 3 months longer than what the doctors expected, it was not clear if he was satisfied with the extra time that, in his mind, God had granted him, or if he expected God to let him live a number of extra years. According to Jerome, the devil does all the bad things, sickness and all, and God can stop the devil. Yet what happens when sickness and misfortune continue? Does this mean that God is punishing the person for his or her sins? Without wise discernment and a mature religious and spiritual faith, viewing everything through a religious lens might set a person up for major disappointments and a spiritual crisis if God does not behave as one wishes. For Jerome, the meaning of life consisted of living the right way or of choosing to do good rather than evil, but he acknowledged that it was not always easy to choose to do the right thing. He said, "You've got a choice. I know you've got a choice. I can choose to drink, which I do drink. I can choose to smoke, which I do smoke. I can choose to quit, which I go through sometimes. I can do anything I want to." Jerome did not live an ethical life of service to others or a life that was dedicated to the common good, which might explain his relatively low wisdom score. Also, he married at age 24. He was intimately involved with 2 other women simultaneously for a number of years. He also had 2 children with other women, but none with his wife. He never met his daughter and left his son when he was 7 years old. He did not know where his daughter or son currently were living, but knew that 2 years ago his son had been in jail. Okay, next case. By contrast, Mark, a 76-year-old white hospice patient who lived at the hospice care center and suffered from the same metastatic cancer as Jerome, had a relatively high wisdom score, but the lowest religious spirituality score in the sample. He had served in World War II, had a graduate degree, and had been an experimental psychologist in his professional life. He married at age 22, was widowed at age 54 after 32 years of marriage, and remarried 3 years later. He had been married to his second wife, who was about 16 years his junior, for 18 years. Mark was raised as a Catholic. He went to Catholic elementary school, had religious parents and siblings, and even had a sister who was a nun. Yet he considered himself, quote, a recovering Catholic. According to Mark, religion, quote, was like a foreign language to me. My first recollection is that it was utter madness to me. He explained, I mean, I never really went into religion. As far back as I can remember, probably in the first grade, I didn't know what they were talking about. Nothing has changed. I thought and still think it's a lot of crap. I don't buy any of it. I went along just to be sociable with the conventions of getting married in church and burying relatives to the church and all that sort of thing. But religion doesn't make any sense to me. It's like I sat down and wrote a story totally out of my imagination that somebody was performing miracles, totally outlandish, silly stuff that has no facts behind it. So the interviewer asked, it's not logical? Yeah, you have to give yourself over like you turn your brains in. Mark's scientific rational mind just could not make sense of the logic-defying narrative of religious faith. Yet, he did not become an atheistic crusader, but granted others their religious beliefs and convictions. He said, religion didn't make sense, but most of the world thinks it makes sense, so instead of arguing all my life, I just go along with it. If you want to go to church or want to do this, like my first wife was pretty religious too, so my kids went to private Catholic schools. Interestingly, Mark's second wife was also very religious and active in the Episcopalian Church. She even studied her faith through an intensive 4-year program. Mark tolerated his wife's faith without in any way supporting it, except for the occasional obligatory church visit with his wife. Not surprisingly, Mark did not believe in God. To the question, in what do you believe, he answered, I don't know. Science? Logic? I don't believe in religion. I think it may be doing more harm than good. A A lot of these people around the world killing each other because they're the wrong religion. I think we might be better off without any religion, but I think you have to have something. A lot of people need something. I wish I had it. I'm jealous of these people who go around smiling and happy like the world is wonderful and Christ is looking down on me. I wish I could do that, but I just can't. I see happy people here dying. I think there's a lot more of us. Most of us are undercover, really. When the interviewer asked Mark if there was anything else he believed in or that was his guiding principle, he answered, I believe in love, caring about others, which I've done often, not as much as I should have. When I was in the war part of my time, I was a rifleman, which is the lowest you can be in the service. I found myself more helping wounded guys than trying to kill anybody. I've done what I could to help out, but I was oriented toward killing people. I tried to keep them from bleeding to death, which wasn't always very successful. To the question, what do you think is the meaning of life? Mark replied, I guess I've thought about it now and then, but I never came to any conclusion that there's any meaning. It's like people evolve or animals evolve. I wouldn't say they are a tribute to some Superman. I don't know. It's just the way life is. So the interviewer asked, what do you think is the meaning of your life? Mark answers, I don't know, not much. I think if I had never been born, the world would have continued on. Also, Mark believed in love and caring about others. His humanistic but non-spiritual perspective made it difficult for him to see a deeper meaning in life in general, and also in his personal life more specifically. This, however, made him an exception among relatively wise elders who tended to score high on meaning in life. All right, and the last case is James, a married, relatively healthy 79-year-old African-American retired school administrator with a graduate degree who lived in the community. James served in World War II right after high school. He had the 5th highest distance score and a relatively high religious spirituality score. James was a lifelong Baptist, like Jerome, a deacon and the president of his Baptist church, and the treasurer of the Gideons, who distribute free Bibles. To the question of how his daily life was influenced by his religion or spirituality, James replied, I feel that religion and your belief in God controls and guides every possible activity of your life. Dealing with people, dealing with employment, dealing with honesty, and all of that. You become dedicated, and something just guides you into the realm of the Lord God. You don't have to stop to think about it. Well, I'm a Christian, I'm going to do this in a Christian way, or I'm going to deal with this in a Christian-like manner. Being a Christian automatically guides you, and I feel that's forever with you once you get into that realm. James exemplified an intrinsic religious orientation by living his religion and dedicating his life to religion and God, as he said, quote, 24 hours a day. He credited his World War II experience with getting closer to God. He explained, you are trying to sit down and talk and see things and relate to how God will take care of you. You don't worry about this, like what's going to happen. God is in charge. That kind of thing brought me much closer to the spiritual. I figured I'd seen so much, so many things happen to soldiers and whatnot that didn't happen to me, that I figured that something was protecting me, that I had no control, no physical control over. That just made a change in my life. His World War II experience did not only change James' spiritual life, but also his mundane life. He had originally planned to get a job right after high school, but when he returned from Europe after the war, he decided to continue his education, inspired by the educated men who served with him in the war. To the question what God means to you, James answered, he is a supreme being and he's always been. We don't have no picture. He can take on any image. God can come to you in the form of another person, the form of your child, and make statements of things that will affect you and bring you to the Christian conscience. This God is both mysterious and very personal at the same time, as he can appear in any form to bring the person back on the righteous and morally Following on this path by contributing to the common good was very important for James. He considered contributing to the common good his meaning in life. He said, I think that every living person should make some contribution, something in return for their being a short span on the earth. William Cullen Bryant said, life is no longer than a clap of a hand, one life. So we have a short life as compared to life on this earth, and we should try to do something that benefits mankind and others who may tread the same trail that we are treading. Make it better for them, not to get all that I can out of life, but to make it better for those who follow. Like the old man building the bridge. He was just building a bridge across the stream. They asked him, old man, at your age, what are you working about building a bridge? He said, I build this bridge not for myself, but I am building it for those who may follow me. That's what I think life is all about. Bridge building. All of us are supposed to be building bridges, making it better for those who will follow. Indeed, contributing to the common good was what James did as a school administrator and what he continued to do as an influential member of his church and a respected member in the community. He said, you become respected and known by your neighbors as an upright person, and they bring you certain problems. For example, if members of the community are overtaken by drugs or alcohol and fall in the streets, who would they call? They don't call the police. They get him up out of the street, take him home, put him in the bed, tell him to sober up, and go to church tomorrow, the brother that's fallen. You get that reputation in the community, and you get a lot of calls, and you can help a lot of people, but who you help, you don't go out calling names and that kind of thing. That's between you and your God and that person. You might tell him, listen, brother or sister, this is just between you and me what happened. You want to straighten up. By that way, you call the people's conscience, and it can make a difference in their life. Water dropping on a rock will knock a hole in it. You see? So you keep tapping on it. You don't break it all at once. James' helpful attitude and behavior exemplified a wise elder who gives wise and gentle advice without shaming the person who has fallen. James knew that in the end it is up to each person to find the right way to live, but at the same time, he did not give up on anyone, but kept dropping water on the rock. So, to summarize, wise people are more likely to identify as spiritual than as religious. Yet not all wise people are spiritual. Some wise individuals hold humanistic values rather than religious values. And not all spiritual and religious people are wise. So, I want to end with this part. What are components of practical wisdom for professionals? Okay, what is a take-home message maybe for you? And this really comes from Gary Schwartz and Kenneth Schwaber's components of practical wisdom for professionals, and they came up with 9 components. So the first one is having proper aims, tailors, and wanting to do the right thing. So in the end, I think for wise people, what is a proper aim? And to do the right thing. In some ways, it's always to contribute to the common good, to help other people to flourish, to contribute in some positive way to the community. The second one is perceptiveness of the specific situation and context. And you probably know this, if you work as ministers or in some kind of, in the helping profession or in any kind that has something to do with other people, you are confronted with things that you have never thought about or that you have never encountered. So you cannot do the routine, but you need to actually look at what is happening right now at this moment, right? And take it all in. And that means you often have to improvise to find novel solutions to new problems because you haven't encountered it before. So and sometimes you have to balance competing and conflicting good aims. There might be both good aims, but they are in conflict. You have to balance this. And therefore, like with the reflective component of wisdom, perspective taken and empathy are very important to understand others, to really understand others. And that means, in order to get there, you have to be a good listener. A good listener and be present in the moment. You cannot just phone it in, right? You have to be there and really, truly listen. And that's actually not easy, to really, truly listen without thinking of, oh, what will I say next? To actually be there and just listen and then answer. And also, what's required is the ability to balance empathy and detachment to make the right decisions. I mean, a simple example would be, yes, if you are confronted by a drug addict, for example, what do they want? Drugs, right? And they really, really, really want it. But, giving a drug addict person drugs would be the worst thing you could do. So therefore, you have to have the detachment. The detachment, yes, this is what you want, but sometimes what you want is not necessarily good for you. And therefore, you need emotional intelligence, making emotions an ally of reason. What does this mean? So we don't ignore emotions, but when we feel emotions, what do they signal to me? If I feel agitated, if I feel depressed, this is something that comes over here, that I feel that the other person is feeling. And using this as an extra part of information. And then finally, experience and willingness to learn from experiences and also from our mistakes. Because we will always make mistakes, and that's okay. We have to be compassionate to ourselves and say, yes, it is okay that I made a mistake, and I will learn from it. And in the future, I try to not do the same mistake again, but we have to be compassionate to ourselves and move on and not berate ourselves. Sometimes sometimes I have the feeling also with my students, that it's, they can be compassionate to others, but they are so harsh on themselves. So harsh on themselves, so critical. And I would ask them, would you be like that as you are to another friend? They say, oh no, I wouldn't do that. But then why do you do it to yourself? Right? So we have to develop self-compassion as well. All right, and I know I'm out of time. Thank you for listening. And I look forward to our conversation and maybe to your questions later. The previous one? Absolutely. Here we go. Yes. All right.
Okay, so I am going to ask a couple questions and then open the floor for you all as you kind of formulate your questions that you have for Dr. Ardelt. So how many of you were in like an ecstatic, rapturous, nerdy zone while she was giving her lecture? Can I get an anybody? So I'm really passionate about trying to find the intersection between like sociology and theology. So I wanted to share just quickly some connections biblically with your research that I find kind of fascinating. I think it's important that we have sociologically informed ministers and sociologically informed spirituality. Can I get an amen on that? So in the Old Testament, many of you will be familiar with this story, but God grants Solomon wisdom. So he can basically ask for anything, right? And the thing that he asks for is wisdom. And if you parse this passage out, will y'all say it with me? God gives Solomon wisdom, the deepest of understanding, and the largest of hearts. Now what I found fascinating in that little verse are three dimensions of wisdom. So the first Hebrew word is chokhmah, And that would be your cognitive, like wise people know stuff, right? The other word in there, the depth of understanding, is the Hebrew word tavon, or tavono, and it means perception or reflective ability, or how to like administer wisdom. And then the final Hebrew phrase there is rochav lev, or mi'od rochav lev, or wideness of heart, or bigness of heart. What does that sound like to anybody? Compassion, right? That pro-sociality compassion zone. So when you break that apart, like the gift that God, Yahweh gives to Solomon, are those three dimensions of cognitive, right? Chokhmah, tabuno, discernment, and then the largeness of heart. I just find that really fascinating, that when science actually proves something about Scripture to be true, can I get an amen on that? So think about those three dimensions there. That's pretty exciting stuff. And so those are just to parse out the Hebrew words there for you a little bit. And I find that kind of Old Testament Solomonic synergy of there. And of course, Jesus, what was one of the things that people called Jesus? A wisdom teacher, a Rabboni, right, who was going around teaching things like, hey, be crafty as a serpent, innocent as a dove, be wise as a serpent, be innocent as a dove. So I just found that to be some really cool connections with your research, which is one of the ways I got fascinated with what you do. So some questions, all right? Question number one, who's your favorite graduate student ever in the history? I'm just kidding, don't answer that. I don't want to have my feelings hurt right now. Don't do it. No, so the first question I thought could be interesting is if you're willing to just share a little bit personally. I know a little bit about your journey in the Catholic Church, and not being like super encouraged to ask the kind of questions that you ask as a sociologist, right? Being told just believe this stuff, right? And then you kind of made your own journey, and now you're with a priest that, if I'm phrasing this correctly in our conversation, you said he's the real deal. So A, could you tell us a little bit about your journey? And B, when you say this priest that you currently have is the real deal, or he's got the spiritual thing that like inspires your own spirituality. And can you say a little bit more about that?
All right. So I'll give you the shorter version. But yes, I grew up as a Catholic, and as a Catholic, you're supposed to go to church once a week, which I did. And when I was around, and I went to communion, got confirmed, but when I was around 14, I was like, what am I doing here? These people wear strange clothes, right? And they're going to these rituals, and I have been going to church, pretty much, as far as I remember, and nothing has changed. I have not become a better person. So pretty much I was kind of, even so I wouldn't have the words for it, but I was yearning for spirituality. And then finally, and there was really nothing else. I mean, it was really just these services that you just went to. And then finally, they offered Bible study at one point. And so I went to Bible study. It was great, right? And I asked these questions, and they were like, well, I don't know. I mean, even the priest, oh, I don't know. Why do you ask these questions, right? And so basically, I said, okay, that wasn't really working out here. And so I am, together with a couple of friends, we got interested in Zen, really, and starting to read, Alan Watts and, some things about Zen. And then when I went to the university, I took a class I studied sociology, but you can take other classes. So I took a class in the religion department on what was Eastern religions, and as part of the Eastern religions, we went on a weekend retreat to learn how to meditate. And then also as part through this professor, to a meditation center, kind of, and we meditated there, and then I got in contact with other classes that they were offered or other retreats, and so I learned Zen meditation. And I did the Zen meditation for about a year, and in the meantime, my then boyfriend, now husband, got in contact with another meditation technique and was very fascinated by it. I didn't go at this time because I just came from the Zen retreat. I said, okay, that's enough for me right now. But then a year later, I also went to this retreat, and that was Vipassana meditation, and I basically have been doing Vipassana meditation ever since. Now, I haven't given up my religious faith, and so because if people say, some people say, oh, you're a Buddhist, I'm not a Buddhist, because I don't follow the Buddhist religious rites and rituals. This is not what I'm doing. Culturally, I'm a Catholic. And Jesus always was my man. I really feel affiliation with Jesus, like a friendship. I really feel this close relationship to Jesus. Or the Holy Spirit, right? So the Holy Spirit, I do feel this connection. But I hadn't been to Catholic Church for a long time until my kids got into this age where they needed to go through communion. And then I started doing that again. And we had this one, what was it, when you learn to become a priest, what is it called? I don't know. So he came, and he was like, wow, his sermons were just, wow, they're very Zen-like sermons, right? And then, but he was only, because he was learning to become a priest, right? So he was then basically sent to another congregation, became the head priest, and I kid you not, the whole congregation was in tears. Really, his goodbye party was like, there was a long line, right? And I went to the nun, afterwards, and I said, I can't believe he left, Father, I left, and we started crying. And he said, wow, you really made a big impression on you. And yes, he did. And then, many years later, after our priest retired, he came back. He's now our priest. And that's what I was saying, he's a real deal. And what makes him the real deal, he's there, he's present. He's not phoning it in, he's actually there. His sermons are very personal. He's talking about his own personal spiritual struggles and his own demons. But he has this connection to everyone. So he personifies, the Holy Spirit, I would say. And that's why I go now to Catholic Mass to hear him preach, quite frankly. So that's my journey.
Good. One of the questions that your research raised for me was, does bad theology kill? Or is bad theology actually harmful? And part of what I pulled at it, some of the studies you mentioned today, and then the study you did with Koenig on the intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity, and then there were some questions in there that basically drove home the point that if people believed God was a punishing, vindictive, like waiting to get you God, they had lower degrees of life expectancy, higher degrees of death anxiety, life satisfaction, those kind of things. That was one factor, and there were other factors like
the extrinsic religious orientation. We didn't measure life expectancy, but extrinsic religious orientation is clearly not good for you. It does increase fear of death, and so it's not that black and white. Some people have both. They have both an extrinsic and an intrinsic religious orientation. But if you control for the other, if you only have an extrinsic religious orientation, this is not good for you. And I think the reason why it's not good for you is because you're exposed to the religious teachings, but you're not doing it, right? You're still living your selfish life, and therefore, you might be worried where you end up after death. and maybe it's not heaven. And if it's not heaven, what's the alternative? Not so great. Whereas the people who don't believe at all, it's like, well, there's nothing there, right? After you're dead, you're dead. That's it. End of story. So why should you be afraid of it? It's like Marx said, why should you be afraid of it? Nothing there.
I'm going to ask one last question and then pass the mic around to whoever's ready. I'm involved with a movement called Fresh Expressions of Church. And so we gather in non-conventional spaces, and part of, there's some research out there that 1 in 3 people have experienced religious trauma. It seems to me, and this is a theory, but that the way we do conventional church and religion maybe programs people more for the extrinsic religiosity. Some people are outliers or anomalies that get more into the intrinsic space. It's mixed, but I just have observed throughout my ministry that people can go to church a lot and not really very much look or think or act very much like Jesus or have that compassion dimension, right? That pro-sociality piece. So what we do with Fresh Expression, we gather in like common places, tattoo parlors, dog parks, burrito places, and we do what we call the listening first spirituality. So we create communities of belonging where the focus is not believing per se, but belonging, which in an epidemic of loneliness and isolation is really important. And another study I read of yours was like if people in hospice or late stages of life, if they had one little small community of people that they could practice their spirituality with, it had positive impact on their health outcomes. So community and doing life together. So we're trying to do that like out in the world kind of spaces. And there's this whole movement out here, right, called spiritual but not religious. So how does your research kind of interact with that or inform that in any way, do you think?
Yeah, it's very interesting when we did this international study and I interviewed some of the older adults, and I have to tell you, this distinction between religious and spirituality, that really starts with the baby boomers. Because before that, like these older adults, the one from the silent generation or the greatest generation, when I said, can you tell me something about your religion and spirituality? For them this was the same. Religion and spirituality, there is no distinction, it's the same. It's starting with the baby boomers. This is when, I did interview some of the older adults, they were like, how spiritual would you think you are, how religious would you think you are? And they were like, religious? Oh, no. But spiritual, absolutely. I am spiritual. And I think there is still this longing for spirituality, right? This longing for self-transcendence, or to be connected to something, to a higher power, something greater than myself. Rather than, this individualism, beyond individualism, I think that's what it is. But this absolutely, where they were saying, oh, definitely not religious, has something to do with, religious scandals, right? I mean, the Catholic Church, with all this, child abuse scandals, and, other religions as well, they are kind of, misusing funds and, saying certain things, but then doing things differently, and then when it comes out, it's like this, it's like, no, I just can't believe in that. People do not, they just want to have my money, but they don't behave in a moral and ethical way, and therefore I'm looking for spirituality in different places. And I think what religion and what really needs is to earn their trust back. And in some ways, I think what we are doing, this is a way of doing it, right? To earning the trust back, And I think, as a Catholic, I think we had, the last Pope was trying to do this, and it looks like the current Pope is trying to do that too, to really earn the trust back and not tolerate, like with the child abuse scandals, what they were doing, just, moving priests from from one congregation to the other without actually dealing with it, just putting it on the carpet, and then if it does come out, this was not a good picture. And so a lot of people left because of that, because you're losing your trust. But it doesn't mean that they give up on spirituality, on being want to be connected to something that is beyond themselves. And so yeah, I think it's a good movement. I like it.
All right, we're gonna pass the mic around to whoever has a question for Dr. Ardelt.
I was thinking about groups like Baha'i and Unitarian, where they are more spirituality, but they still gather and do church-like stuff, but they don't focus. So I guess I'm trying to think of how they would fit on your scales.
Well, I don't know. I honestly don't know, because I think we had nobody from these groups in our sample, so I couldn't really tell you. But it's an interesting, the Unitarians are really interesting, right? I mean, they welcome everybody, even the atheists, which I thought was very interesting. Atheists, I mean, I thought you were a religious group, so how can you welcome atheists? But I think it's about community, right? And trying to connect to some spirit, some spiritual. So I think that I don't know about the Baha'i, I mean, that part I really don't know anything about it. But I think the longing is still there, so looking for places, where you can find it, where you find this community, is still very much alive. And yeah, and there are different groups, and you can find it in different places, I mean, there are a lot of, think about the mindfulness movement, for example, even so, this has become like mindfulness, right? So I don't completely, I have some criticism that's not everywhere, right? Mindfulness for soldiers, okay, good, you can better kill, I don't know, right? If this was intended in this way, but there's still this longing for something, and so yeah, wherever you can find it.
Can you become wise by yourself? All by yourself?
Yeah, and it's a good question. I think it would be very hard. I think it might not be impossible. But often it's done, what do you mean by yourself? I mean, often people who feel drawn to this path read, right? They read books. And so is this all by yourself? I would say no, right? I mean, because then you gain from the wisdom of others. So when I started on this path, I read a lot, Ellen Watts said these little books, were basically trying to lead you to mindfulness, really, that's what it was. And so all by yourself might be very hard, but maybe through books it might be possible. And also sometimes people have these spiritual experiences through traumatic events. Now it doesn't mean, you don't want to wish for traumatic events, because it can also definitely lead to the opposite, right? More often than the positive things. But sometimes people do have that, have spontaneous spiritual encounters. So I think it's possible, but I think it definitely helps if you have a faith community or a spiritual community that supports you.
Can I reflect on that? Because I'm just thinking about the compassion dimension and seeking the common good and neighboring and feeling the pain of others and being them also. Wouldn't that require kind of a social dimension to grow in that aspect of the three-dimensionalism?
Well, yes. I mean, but the question was, can you become wiser by yourself, right? I mean, yes. And then, of course, you would go out and show it, right?
read one time Voltaire once said that things would be so much simpler if everyone just stayed in their rooms. So I was just thinking in practical terms, you need wisdom for social interactions, right? Because of the friction of
Yes.
social interactions
Yes.
called forth. So that was kind of behind my question, that it's a necessity in some ways.
Yes.
It can be.
Yes, I mean, definitely, particularly, this is where I'm saying this is part of the cognitive component. You have to understand yourself, but also you have to understand others. And then, with the compassionate component and the reflective component, really, to look at things from different perspectives, to understand the other person, also to understand yourself, and then being willing, right, to basically, to get into this common we, to share space, right, and to share, whatever unfolds, and that requires wisdom, and to do it in what is often said, in a skillful manner, right, in a skillful manner basically to further the common good, right? Okay.
I have a question here in the corner. Thank you for the talk. I'm glad that Alice mentioned Voltaire because what I was thinking the whole time was the sort of the long shadow of the Enlightenment here, Enlightenment thinking,
Yes.
and whether or not wisdom is because it seems to me that wisdom in this context is diametric to religion as sort of an opposite, or spirituality and religion, and I wonder if that's an assumption that we actually can't make. In part by some of the answers that some of the people serving here are. So if you ask somebody who's got a high wisdom scale of what life means and they don't know, that doesn't seem wise to me. And so, is wisdom constructed in such a way, or viewed in American society at least, that it is diametric to these things, or is it something that can be actually more integrated into, and also, I thank you, Alice, for that question about can you be wise alone, because it plays, I think, to a larger question of contextual global religions, because some religions do place an emphasis on isolation and sort of.
Well, first of all, the example I gave you of Mark, who was very high relatively high on wisdom and low on spirituality, or on religious spirituality, he was really an exception. He was the only one whose qualitative interview I had. I think maybe there were like 3 people. These was really more exceptions, right? So this is not what you typically find. But there's this difference between spirituality and religiosity. So as I said, and also depending how you measure it, right? If you measure it as if you measure wisdom as self-transcendence, you do have this positive relationship with at least spirituality. So there's another colleague of mine, Jester. He argues that spirituality is a component of wisdom, and in his scale, spirituality is included. Now, not in my scale, and the reason why I don't want to include it is I want to give the humanists a chance, right? Because I think that, like Mark, he's really the humanist, and I think you can be wise if you are humanistic. But keep in mind, what is the humanist? It's just that, look, it just doesn't make sense to me. Religion just doesn't make sense to me, but I still want to dedicate my life to the common good, and so, and I think that shouldn't disqualify somebody from, having a high wisdom score, and it doesn't. But ultimately, I think spirituality is part of wisdom. Because if you do continue on the path toward wisdom, I think people do realize the material world is not the end. There are other dimensions beyond the material world, right? And I think this is part of wisdom. But on the path toward wisdom, by the humanists, I think also score relatively high.
I just wanted to add one, I can say it just quickly, is that if you look in some places like France, there's some very interesting contradictory or paradoxical examples. There was a school in the maybe last 20 years called spiritual atheism, wrap your head around that, which, again, it could be word games, it could be something else, but it's trying to contend with these kind of usually not overlapping worlds. So it's just interesting to see how that plays out in other contexts. And it was a Christian movement. So.
I was just curious about what conversations you may have had around concepts of humility, or if you see humility correlated with any of your discussions on wisdom and spirituality. Of course, as Christians, I feel like it's this term that we want to embody but don't describe well, and I see some of your research corresponding with a healthier way of describing humility.
Yeah, so no, definitely humility. I think is a consequence of wisdom. I think it could also, could it be a predictor? I don't know. In some wisdom models, it's part of wisdom. They include it, but they include it as intellectual humility, basically. Well, I think in my case, it would be in the cognitive component. I know there's more to know. So acceptance that I cannot know everything, and that's what the intellectual humility. I think the other humility is part of the reflective component in some ways, to see that we are all in the same boat, and to understand myself thoroughly, and to understand that I'm not perfect. And that's become, makes me more tolerant toward other people who I clearly see they are not perfect, right? But to really go into this, yes, and so am I, and so am I, yes. So yes, I think it's definitely a part of wisdom. But it's more kind of indirectly, I think, in my model.
Research and for letting us see into that as a tool today. I want to invite you now to a delicious lunch, and we're going to have a great time around the tables, sharing this food together, preparing for our next Lunch and Learn lecture. Let's pray. God, we give thanks for the food that we're about to eat, for all that has happened, so that we could be in this moment around these tables to share this meal together. We thank you for the gifts of wisdom and compassion. May those things deepen and flourish even around our table today, even as a part of our meal today, that we would listen, that we would share, that we would love, that as we're nourished, that we would be grateful, and that we would give thanks for a day in which we can engage with our minds, with our hearts, with our strength. Thank you for your presence with us in this space. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Please enjoy lunch. If you have a dietary restriction that you've noted,